This is Off Planet Radio.
Welcome to another dimension, a dimension of insight. You are entering a place where reality collides with truth.
We're here.
There are no limits, there are no boundaries. This is Off Planet Radio.
Well, after much ado and great delay, welcome to the live edition of Off Planet Radio. I'm Randy Moggins. It is March the 7th, 2012, and I apologize for the delay there. We had several connection problems getting things lined up, and it's all good now. We are live and streaming on the mighty WSR WolfSpiritRadio.com. The chat rooms are up, and we will be taking calls over the course of the show. So if you have questions or comments for the guest, we will get to that in the due course of this first hour, hopefully. We're going to run 2 hours tonight. My guest is Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. And just a couple of announcements. First off, I want to say thanks. A number of people have hit the donate button on the website at offplanetradio.com, and I want to thank you for supporting our efforts here, for putting some weight behind what we do, and thank you so much for doing that. Also, next week, 2 hours, we will have James Martinez online, and he's going to be talking about cold fusion and the social implications of free energy. James is the spokesman for cold fusion, and some of the things going on around the discovery by Dr. Rossi over in Italy. We'll talk about that. It's highly controversial, and so again, we'll be discussing all of that next week with my guest, James Martinez. Coming up the following week, we are going to do a show on the Indigo Children, Crystal Children, Ascension, things that sound kind of new agey. We're going to find out what that's all about. My guest will be Krista, and I also have a UFO contactee who will be joining me during the course of that program. Without any further delay, I want to welcome my guest. He is a doctoral in patristics from the University of Oxford. He also has a background in physics. He writes on alternative history and science and what he calls strange stuff. His current book is called Apocalypse Theater Part 1, Yahweh the Two-Faced God. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Nazi technology. We're going to talk about a lot of things that play into the arena of the alternative culture. Joseph Farrell, welcome to Off Planet Radio.
Thanks for having me on, Randy. Pleasure to be here.
It's good to finally get you on the air. I think we've been crisscrossing each other for a number of years.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting how we've overlapped. You've obviously been doing journeyman's work. You've published, gosh, how many books have you published now?
It'll be 16. 2 of them out now are with my co-author, Dr. Scott DeHart, including the Yahweh book that you mentioned. And we've got another one in press that should be out in October, November with Farrell House. And I'm working on another one right now, and so is he. So we're busy.
Good stuff. You busy guys. You're busy.
Yeah.
And so, give us your website and anything else you want to put out in terms of contact information, Joseph.
My website is www.gizadeathstar.com. That's all one word, all lowercase, and Giza is spelled Giza. And they can get all my books right there off the web store.
Good stuff. We're going to talk, I think, in the first hour. I want to go maybe kind of spin backwards through your well-connected body of work, because your work is very connected. You begin with the Giza Death Star in 2001 and bring it forward. And right. I think maybe what we'll do is we'll kind of spin backwards in this, because I want to talk to you a little bit about this book, Yahweh the Two-Faced God, which is part one, I assume, of a multiple part series you've entitled Apocalypse Theater. That's an intriguing title to me.
It's a title that my co-author and I have been talking about for a number of years. We're looking at the apocalyptic culture that surrounds us, and a lot of it's coming out of religion, as you know, and a lot of it's coming out of New Age and ufology, and it seems to go into two streams, Randy. We've got a utopian version of it in a lot of the New Age, with expectations of ETs coming to help mankind out of this difficulty. With 2012, there's the Raised Consciousness School, and then on the other hand, you've got the religious crowd that are literally pushing for the apocalyptic events of the Book of Revelation to happen, or if you're Muslim, for the Imam Mahdi to come back, or if you're an Orthodox Jew, you're expecting the Messiah, and all the apocalyptic genocidal events that go on with that. So, we decided that we'd kick it off by looking at the whole character of Yahweh in the Old Testament.
Now, in this book, you present a very detailed and fascinating outline of what you call the God Yahweh, the Yahwist religion, this monolithic, vengeful God of wrath that's pictured in the Old Testament. Where do we begin the narrative on this God, and how do we dovetail it over into what is now present-day Christianity?
Well, that's a good question, and part of where we begin comes out of the fact that Dr. DeHart both had long ecclesiastical experience, and it was for both of us an unhappy one. We both went through a lot of suffering and anguish because of it. And over the years, we talked quite a bit about this phenomenon, and we came to the conclusion that the behavior that we had seen, that had been dished out to us individually, was not just an accident of, badly behaved people. It's endemic to the Yahwist religions, because it comes out of the moral schizophrenia of Yahweh himself. And that's where we went back and looked at Egyptologists, essentially, and their view of Yahweh. Because, as you say, what we've got here is a moral contradiction. We've got, on the one hand, claims that this is a God of love and so on and so forth, and yet, on the other hand, if you read the Old Testament with anything like objectivity, this God is ordering the Hebrews to go around and slaughter people. And, there's all sorts of crazy, kooky reasons advanced for this in theological circles. But the bottom line, Randy, for us, was that if this behavior were exhibited by any human being, they'd be hauled up for war crimes. You'd have very little difference between the behavior that's described in the Old Testament and the behavior of the great dictators of the 20th century, Hitler and Stalin, Mao, and so on. So this appeared to us to be the place to start, is to show the moral contradiction. And then we wanted to show the problem that results from this, and this is really where we started with the book. The problem that results, Randy, is that you have a division of the social space. Look what we have. We have a claim that a man went up a mountain, had a special message delivered to him personally by someone claiming to be God. So we're initially put into the position that you either have to accept this on faith or reject it. So there's a schism in the social space. If you accept it, then you subject yourself to all the programming that goes along with that moral schizophrenia. The other problem that this whole Yahwist tradition introduces is it introduces what we like to call a schism in the temporal space, because if you look at the way Egypt is portrayed in those first 5 books of the Bible, Egypt comes to symbolize all that is darkness, all that's idolatrous, all that's rejected. So the other problem of the Yahwist traditions is they are secondary religions. They are always based on a rejection of a prior tradition. They are based on something that's assumed in order for them to define themselves in opposition to it. So in other words, opposition to the sort of cosmological nature religions of the rest of the world becomes one of the defining features of the Yahwist tradition, be it Judaism, be it Christianity, be it Islam. Mm-hmm. So it introduces into the psychological space of the person joining or practicing one of those religions. It introduces into the psychological space the paradigm that every human being that one encounters is viewed in mechanistic terms rather than humanely. They're either viewed as potential converts or potential enemies. So you have this constant paradigm of infidel versus believer, heretic versus orthodox, and so on and so forth. So in other words, the program is a program ultimately of the division of humanity.
Now, as we talk about this, we're dealing obviously with the Yahwist tradition. Obviously, the Bible itself portrays a very narrow historical view, something that most biblical literalists can't deal with. Do we have overlapping chronologies that give us a wider clue as to the historical epoch in which this was all occurring? In other words, something that gives us another picture of what you call the social space in history.
Oh, well, I've written several books dealing with ancient culture, with ancient cosmologies, with ancient philosophy. And basically, we come down to the fact that there is and this has been throughout all of my books, that there was a very high civilization in high antiquity that predates Egypt, that predates Babylon, and predates the Indus Valley. And each of these civilizations in turn views themselves as a legacy. But the basic cosmological metaphor is that they all share something in common, and that is that there is a creator, and as a result of that, it's a natural religion. In other words, it's not something that is revealed to one person alone on a mountaintop. It's accessible to all. And this is what Yahwism defines itself in opposition to, because the very nature of those three Yahwisms is the idea of a special revelation that sets a certain group of people apart from the rest of the world. And the other thing, Randy, you asked, and I didn't address this, you asked why we chose the term apocalypse theater. Well, one of the problems of the Yahwist traditions is that once you make a claim to have a direct and special message from God or from E.T. or whatever, you'll notice that the same meme also works in ufology.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. The problem is once you have made that claim, then the claim requires you to believe that your system, your doctrinal system, is a claim to absolute truth, all right, to which every human being either must submit or be converted. And that inevitably introduces into those Yahwehs what Dr. DeHart and I call the apocalypse meme. In other words, the final triumph of the religion, the final triumph of the truth, according to them, always lies in a future. And if you look and examine the futures depicted very carefully, those futures, in most instances, are depicted as being imposed by violence on the rest of humanity. So in other words, the whole apocalypse meme is also a part of the dialectical necessity of these religions. It is something that is inbuilt in them. So we wanted to expose that and get people to thinking, about these truth claims, because, you don't have to look too far wide in the world today to see what problems are arising from these conflicting truth claims.
As you did, and Dr. DeHart as well, I come from a pretty steep background of theology and religion, and specifically Judeo-Christianity as it's framed. And within that context is this constant need to reinforce the legitimacy of the religion itself. And the way it's done here, it's done through the written word, the Bible, and then secondarily through the invoked word, the ritual, and all the other things attached to that. But it appears to me to be a framework that is self-enforcing unto itself without any outside referential points. Is that kind of a fair way of looking at that?
Well, yes, I would agree, and I think if Dr. DeHart were here, he would as well, because what you have in those religions is, first of all, you have a book God. The book literally becomes God. The system becomes God, and therefore it must be defended at all costs, be it in terms of intellectual commitment or even more violent acts to do so. But the real problem there is that the book also functions as a set of programming. In other words, you know as well as I do that the Judeo-Christian tradition is very good at a kind of self-policing. If you find yourself thinking of certain thoughts that fall outside of the doctrinal system that you've embraced, then it becomes part of your programming to assume that I'm straying close to the edge of the faith. I'm going to fall outside the box. And again, this is one reason we wanted people to look at the early founding of Yahwism by looking at the moral contradiction of the character himself as is depicted in the Old Testament. The book becomes God. And in the ancient metaphor that Yahwisms define themselves against, the book literally is all of creation. In other words, it's something everyone has access to. There's no, so to speak, no need or necessity for special revelation, for a special message. Everybody manifestation of it. All right, that's the key here. By defining themselves in opposition to Egypt, they're really defining themselves against a universal tradition that is widespread all the way from Vedic India to Mayan Central America to Lakota North America. You've got a fairly consistent version of the cosmological metaphor in all of those cultures that Yahwism defines itself against.
So the people who would be seen as, let's say, a more nature-oriented, worshiping type people who experience God through the natural elements, through what we would consider to be indigenous people today, would be closer to what we would consider to be the outside group relative to the Yahwist religion.
Yeah, exactly. Yahwism defines itself against that primordial tradition. That's the crux of the matter. And as long as it does so, in other words, by defining itself in opposition to something pre-existing, to a certain extent, it always needs that enemy to fight. Otherwise, it loses its self-identity. So in other words, I go back to what I said before. You by adopting this paradigm of belief in a special message from a higher being or beings, you are always in the mentality or mindset of looking at every other human being in a mechanistic way as either a potential convert to your system, to your thinking, or a potential enemy to it. There's no room in your moral compass to treat people with compassion first. Your first thought is of them, where do they stand in terms of my belief system? And you know as well as I do from dealing with Christianity that this is almost an inbuilt habitual response to people. This drive to witness, so to speak, for your faith. It always enters the conversation rather than having a sincere, genuine interest in someone else as a human being.
In your studies of this, and I'm relating now specifically to this thing we call the Bible.
Right.
Does it appear that there are numerous gods mentioned in the Old Testament and that there was simply a dominant God which took over at some point?
Well, that's a very good question. There is a school of thought in biblical scholarship, Randy, out there right now that does indeed take the view that the Hebrews had a whole council of gods, and you don't have to look very far if you know the ancient Hebrew.
Right.
The term Elohim, which is used for God, is translated that way in most English translations. Well, the word Elohim literally means gods. The ending of that word, the him, is a 3 or more plural ending, and that incidentally is the term that's used in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, where
yes.
God says, let us make man in our image. Well, quite literally, what it's saying there is the gods are saying, let us make man in our image. In other words, it's a real plurality. It's not a plurality of royalty or anything else. There's a biblical scholar out there right now by the name of Dr. Michael Heiser that has taken this view. So it is something that biblical scholars are aware of.
Right. He's talking there about the divine council, where
the divine council.
I think he stopped short of a designation of them as gods, but more as like this advisory council. And we've had people on the show who have articulated a number of different things, including the idea that yes, there is a pantheon of gods that were co-creators within the cosmology of what we would consider to be the singular creator.
Right. There is a long Christian patristic tradition that essentially takes a similar view. So, it's nothing new. Mm-hmm. What the real question I think that you're addressing there is, where does Yahweh fit into that picture?
Yeah.
Well, if you look at his behavior, can you really sit down and say what morally distinguishes his behavior from the behavior of Satan or Lucifer? And when you get right down to it, if this is a fascinating to explore. If you get right down to it, who ordered more executions and murders and genocides in the Old Testament? Mm-hmm. Yahweh or Satan? So in other words, if it's true that you know someone by their fruits, then what does this say about this Old Testament God? If it is true that, Christ actually spoke the words, you are of your father, the devil, and he was a liar and murderer from the beginning, then what does that really say? The church has wrestled with that, and there have been theological responses to that little conundrum that range the whole board. But most of those responses, Randy, ignore the basic problem, and that is this moral schizophrenia.
So, in your book, you talk a great deal about opposition to the metaphor. Can you explain a little bit about what the metaphor is? Because you seem to you capitalize it, and maybe it gives us a place to kind of understand this opposition, and also kind of a context to frame this in. People who don't have a background in theology, Joseph, and you have among us a great deal of learning. I've spent a lot of years in this, and I have to admit that when I bump up against this, there are a number of quandaries that present themselves in identifying the context.
Right. Well, the metaphor is something that I've written about all the way back, really, to a book called The Giza Death Star Destroyed. I wrote about it again at great length in The Philosopher's Stone. Dr. DeHart and I wrote about it in greater length in Grid of the Gods. Obviously, we incorporated it into Yahweh, the Two-Faced God. And again, we wrote about it in our book that's coming out this fall called Transhumanism. The metaphor basically underlies, to give you a bit of a historical overview, basically underlies the thinking of the Vedic texts from India. It underlies a lot of the Mesopotamian texts, if you look carefully enough. It certainly definitely underlies the thinking of the Mayan Popol Vuh, their version of, their sacred scriptures. And most importantly, it underlies the civilization and culture of Egypt, out of which comes, of course, the writings of the Hermetica, the Neoplatonic philosophers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Now, the metaphor is this, and it's very important for people to understand what I'm now going to do. This is a thought experiment, all right? In order to show why the metaphor doesn't require faith in a religious sense. If you can imagine a realm or a sea or an abyss of an infinitely extended sameness, in other words, in which there is absolutely nothing distinguishing about it. If you can imagine that, then what you're dealing with there is, in fact, a nothing, capital N, all right? Mm-hmm. Because in the physics sense, and please understand, this is where the physics part of this comes in. This is why it's not necessarily a religious metaphor.
Right, and this is the cool part, too.
This is the cool part, and this is the part, as you say, that raises all sorts of huge, huge questions. And as I say, Dr. DeHart and I got into those questions in the Yahweh book and Grid of the Gods. We get into it again in the Transhumanism book coming out this autumn. When you imagine this infinitely extended nothing, in physics terms, you are dealing precisely with nothing, because for something to be an object to science, to physics, it must be distinguished. It must have some distinguishing features, all right, to be an observable object. Mm-hmm. So we've got this infinite nothing, and obviously, when you're saying this, you're also dealing with something that lies wholly outside of space and time. All right? Now, imagine that you cleave that space, that you simply imagine drawing a line through it or something to that effect. All right? At the immediate instant that you do so, you have created 3 things, each of which is, so to speak, a differentiated nothing. You've got one region of nothing, you've got another region of nothing, and then you've got the common surface between the two, which is itself a kind of a nothing. And this is exactly the cosmology that you see unfolding in the Vedas. It's exactly the cosmology that you see unfolding in things like the Egyptian Edfu texts. It's exactly the cosmology that you see with the Neoplatonists, and you even have a version of it with the Mayans, as I said before. Now, the very fact that you can imagine, that you can think of doing this, and the very fact that you have instantly created a 1-3, all right? This is the reason that so many ancient cultures have trinities, primordial trinities. You need to only think of Vishnu, Brahma, and Shiva in the Vedic tradition, or the one nous world soul in the Neoplatonic tradition, Father, Son, Holy Spirit in the Christian tradition, and so on and so forth. On and on we could go. But in other words, what I'm suggesting here is that this metaphor is so widespread, and it comes out of thought. It comes out of imagining that first step, the initial event, the first event, so to speak, which gave rise to everything else. This is the cosmology, and this is why in those societies, in those philosophical systems, you don't have appeals to special revelation, the special messages given to certain individuals authorized to speak for God or the gods. Literally everybody, at a certain extent, has this. Now, it's interesting, just to add an aside, because obviously I'm skipping enormous amounts of historical data. It is true that within the Vedic culture, that you did see the rise of Brahmanism, of an elite priestly class that was according to their own statements, empowered to interpret this metaphor. But it's equally interesting to note that the person that undid all of that and said, no, you are misunderstanding the metaphor. Everybody is a manifestation of this nothing. Well, guess what his name was? His name was Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. That's precisely what he was objecting to, was this later accretion of a priestly elite to interpret this metaphor. All right. So yeah, this is essentially what Yahwism defines itself in opposition to, because this metaphor, if you look carefully at Old Testament statements, is a form of idolatry. All right? Because ultimately, this metaphor does not allow you to make a crystal clear distinction between creator and creation. All right? To some extent, in that metaphor, particularly in the Egyptian and Hermetic versions of it, mankind is a co-creator, a participator in the act of bringing about creation. That's particularly true. You see it particularly in the Hermetic texts that come out of the Egyptian tradition. But anyway, I'm rambling, but I hope that makes...
No, actually, you weren't rambling. No, you pulled a lot of elements into that are worth considering. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about people listening to this, and especially people who maybe heard me on radio years ago, and their thoughts in terms of, I am completely burning the bridge behind me in terms of monotheism, in terms of what is written in the Bible, and some people thinking, well, he's lost his faith, he's lost his mind. But for me, talking to you, and we've had some conversations, this is a clarifying process, because attempting to reconcile the God of love in the New Testament, to whom Jesus refers to as the Father, with this monolithic, wrathful God in the Old Testament has been, quite frankly, a struggle for many years. Sure. And I think for
for most people.
And I think for a lot of people, Joseph, there is now an opportunity for resolution within a context that doesn't destroy one's belief in God or one's belief in the work that Jesus did when he was on the earth.
Well, this is the other thing that we were trying to point out in this book, is this metaphor is, how to put it, this metaphor actually frees you. Once you understand the very, very high mathematical explicitness of the metaphor, and you'll note that in the Yahweh book, we actually couch the metaphor in formally explicit mathematical terms, all right? And the reason why is to show that it can be put in those terms, all right? Now, once you've seen that, then you can look behind the texts from the Vedas to Mesopotamia, to the Hermetic text, to the Neoplatonists, to the Christian fathers, to the Mayan Popol Vuh. You can look behind all of the religious language of various textual traditions and see that, in fact, they're talking about the same thing. In other words, the metaphor frees you from the book God, frees you from making a book or a system God. All right? And it allows you to see its occurrence in all cultures, because it quite literally does exist in almost all human cultures.
Most of people who have been raised in the West in the form of Christianity that we would refer to as fundamentalism or evangelicalism have been raised to believe that it is heresy to consider so-called, quote, pagan, unquote, religions as co-equal in some way. These are to be considered by those faiths as the heathen. They are either to be converted or to be ostracized or ultimately to be destroyed.
Right. Well, again, I go back to what I've said previously. That mentality comes out of the moral schizophrenia of adopting the character of Yahweh and the text that depicts that character as your God. And please understand, Randy, that what happens when people do this, like it or not, is they enthrone a text. They enthrone their system as God. All right? They're more about defending a book than about understanding the illumination within their own heart. All right? Now, you raised the question of the response of Christianity to the metaphor. And this is where modern I call it the American civil religion because it has little to do with any form of actual historic Christianity. It's an American invention, and it's a cobbled together, horribly conflicted theological and moral system.
Yes, to say the least.
If you go back to the early church fathers, I'm thinking of people like Anaxagoras or Justin Martyr or even Clement of Alexandria, people like that. Mm-hmm. If you go back to this group of what are called apologists in academic circles, it doesn't take you very long to discover that these men were dealing with this metaphor in a major way, and they had to admit that there had to be some truth with it. As far as they were concerned, this was a truth that had become garbled by demons. Well, this is precisely the point of going back then and looking at the morally conflicted character of Yahweh, because if ever there was a garbling of the metaphor, it comes from that special revelation and the claims to a special revelation that are made, on behalf of those books of Moses. So that's where the metaphor gets garbled, in my opinion. And I'm not speaking for my co-author here, but I think that if he were here tonight, he would probably agree. I mean, we've talked about this whole thing for almost 2 decades. So, it's a morally conflicted vision, and that's why, again, you get the mechanistic response to other human beings in terms of the convert-enemy dialectic. It's always there because it's part of the character that the religion is founded upon. It's systemic. It cannot be gotten rid of. And all attempts of theology from the early church fathers down till today have never successfully resolved that problem, in my opinion. And again, I think Dr. DeHart would agree.
Yeah, hopefully the next time I have you on, we will bring Dr. DeHart on as well, because there's a lot more that in future shows I want to cover.
Yeah, he has, he came out of a slightly different Christian tradition than I did, but nevertheless, and he's studied a lot more in terms of the Vedic culture and so on and so forth. So it's very important, I think, for people to understand that his reasons and motivations for saying certain of the things that we did in this book would be slightly different than mine, and I think equally beneficial.
Now, if we flash forward a little bit,
sure.
Right now, we sit in the present time. We're in 2012, and quite frankly, the air is thick with all sorts of expectations, and you kind of alluded to this early on in the show. But we're at a boiling point on a number of fronts right now, and one of them happens to be, no surprise, the Middle East, and specifically Iran, and specifically Israel. Right. And the expectations wrapped around this are so rife with danger. My words fail me. And for years, on my other radio shows, I have assailed those who held to Zionist beliefs based on the very system that we're talking about. My missing link at that time was that I was still trying to reconcile a set of, let's just call them 2 data sets that didn't match. And for a lot of people who will hear the show later on, because it will thread through different networks over the time as it goes out, I've been in this state of distress over this. How did we get to this point? How do we resolve this? How do we bring the world to a place where it's not on the verge of war because of the three Yahwist faiths? And we have right now, I mean literally a hair trigger sitting in the Middle East. And a lot of it is because of the extreme factions of Zionism, Christianity, and Islam.
All right. Yeah. And again, I can understand why your words fail, because this is such a huge topic. And Dr. DeHart and I did get into it in that book, but certainly not in anywhere near the depth that it could have been done. Let's first of all look simply at the historical Christian doctrine versus the modern American abomination of dispensationalism in particular, and in particular the rapture doctrine, because this is playing and fueling a big part of the American geopolitical response to the Middle East. All right? In historical Christian doctrine, and please understand when I use that term, I'm not talking about the Baptist religion, the believer's baptism religion. I'm talking about Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Anglicanism primarily. In other words, those churches that can claim and do show an actual historical pedigree dating back to the early apostles. Within that body of doctrine, the doctrine of Christ, if you examine the writings of the church fathers, is that Christ is consubstantial with all men. In other words, by the claim that God becomes man when he dies and rises again on the cross, that is a sacrifice that affects everyone in all times and in all places, bar none. All right? That means, as a result, that in classical Christian teaching, there is an absolute, once for all, final abolition of any special claims of the part of Israel being the Jewish people as some sort of special vehicle chosen by God. All right? And therefore, there can be no return whatsoever to any Old Testament system of sacrifice. All right? Now, when we go to the rapture doctrine, this is exactly what is being claimed in the claim that the church is going to escape the suffering of the tribulation, which is a massive misreading of Scripture. And with that claim, when the church is taken out of the world, they fall back on a reinstitution of the Old Testament sacrifices and the special privileges of Israel. And that, of course, precedes the coming of Antichrist and so on and so forth.
Sure, yeah.
In their interpretation of Daniel and Revelation and some other texts.
Right.
Now, the whole problem is, first of all, this is all based, again, as we discussed before, even in the classic historical Christian position, this is all based on the character of Yahweh and the moral contradiction therein. Because even in those systems, you have the requirement that mankind owes God an infinite debt but can't pay it, and only God can pay it, therefore God becomes man, and God slaughters himself quite literally to pay off this debt. So in other words, in the system, it reduces again to a mechanistic view, because what does this make God? It makes God a banker balancing account books, all right? And the whole drama of the life of Christ, as depicted in the Gospels, is nothing, therefore, other than a stage play, an account juggling trick to make the books balance. All right, and that sort of defeats the idea of God being a loving, forgiving God if He can't forgive anybody without requiring the slaughter and sacrifice of His own Son by torture and execution. The system. In no way you approach this system can you avoid this inherent moral contradiction. As long as you canonize the character of Yahweh and therefore canonize certain texts as your authority, as your program, this moral contradiction cannot be avoided. So you ask the question, how do we step back from this apocalyptic abyss? Well, in the end of the book, Dr. DeHart and I say essentially that it's not so much the idea of God that has to go. It's the idea that you make the equation God equals Yahweh. That's the problem. Because once you've accepted that, then you've opened yourself up to the truth claims either of Judaism or of Christianity or of Islam. That's the problem. So that's why we spent so much time with that metaphor, to show that the metaphor of that primordial trinity, that 1-3 producing three entities, there is your metaphor of love right there. And if it's capable of being presented in the Vedic context, or in the Hermetic context from Egypt, or in the Neoplatonic tradition, or in the Mayan tradition, if it's capable of being presented in any sort of philosophical way, then you don't need a special revelation in order to believe in it. That's the key right there.
I guess I
hope that made sense.
No, you planted so much out there, and if I was going to be a good talk show host, I would have something to just follow that up on, but I'm sitting here and my head's spinning, because we have, I guess where I'd like to go with this is,
sure.
Was there an attempt in fusing together these old Hebrew manuscripts, which, are not as old as most people believe them to be, onto the New Testament, so-called, and putting it into this book between black covers called the Bible? Was that all an attempt to fuse together these two, what they call dispensations, in a way that theoretically they would harmonize, and we would somehow reconcile the schizophrenic Godhead that we have?
Well, I think what you're really asking there is the question, were these books the creation of an elite in order to
basically,
in order to empower itself? All right?
Yeah.
Now, we've been talking on the implicit assumption that the character of Yahweh, that there is a real character that was behind all of those Old Testament stories. Mm-hmm. But now let's assume, for the sake of argument, the opposite point of view. Let's assume that the character was made up. All right. What you would have then, of necessity, is someone concocting these texts in order to empower themselves. Because number one, look at what that does, what this moral contradiction does. It empowers a certain group of people to speak in behalf of it and attempt to resolve contradictions. That's number one. Number two, the creation of this kind of moral schizophrenia is a kind of social engineering. Oh, I love you, and please understand that I'm beating you and slaughtering you for your own good. This is a kind of abuse mechanism that is a way of gaining control, of gaining influence over people through the process of abuse. This is why it takes so long, and I loved your word the other night that you used when we were speaking. This is why it takes so long for people to detoxify from this process.
Yeah.
Because it is a technique of social engineering. It is a classic technique used by elites to empower themselves by putting out two mutually contradictory data sets and then proffering a synthesis of those data sets. And this keeps going on and on and on. We know the process in secular terms as the Hegelian dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Well, this is exactly what you have in those texts. You've got a thesis and then antithesis. You've got two contradictory moral data sets that the elite can then manipulate and keep themselves in power. So, do I think that is a possible hypothesis for the origin of these texts? You betcha. And I'll go even further, Randy, and say that if you look carefully
at the statements in the book of Ezra, for example, after the return of the Hebrews from the Babylonian exile, you can see evidence in the statements there that there is something going on the part of the priestly elite to codify and systematize the Jewish religion, and that certainly would have included their texts. So is it possible? You betcha. Now, you asked about the New Testament, and I don't want to get too much in detail, but if you look at two things in a very broad fashion, I'm not trying to get nitpicky and into all sorts of pettifogging details here, but if you look at two things in the New Testament, you have essentially a kind of quasi-hermetic expression in the Gospel of St. John, and to a lesser extent in some of the epistles. And then you've got the reassertion of Yahwism with the Synoptic Gospels, which attempt to tie the life of Christ more directly back to the Old Testament.
Yes.
And even more importantly, you have this character by the name of Paul, all right, whom we are asked to believe was given a special revelation all by himself, out alone on the road.
No second witness,
desert.
no third witness.
Yeah, right, exactly. We're asked to believe that this man was given a special revelation alone on a road, kind of like George Adamski out in the high desert of California with his aliens, all right?
Yeah.
And on the basis of this, if you read the epistles attributed to Paul, what you see there is a systematic re-Yahwisizing, to coin a word, of the life of Christ. Now, I am dying to share the insight of my co-author, Dr. DeHart, concerning who he thinks Paul was. But I think it's clear that here we have a case that could be made that, again, something may have been co-opted by an elite attempting to keep this metaphor plugged up. Because if the metaphor ever really fully breaks out into the open, as it almost did in a complete fashion during the Italian Renaissance, if it ever breaks out into the open, it's a huge threat to these entrenched religious systems and their empowered elites. I mean, my word, you only need to look in the Renaissance period at how men who were championing this metaphor, Tommaso Campanella, Giordano Bruno, and people like this, were either imprisoned or burned alive.
Yeah.
Because they were a threat to the entire system.
So we sit here on the precipice of this 2012 juggernaut. We have a ruling elite in the world, and we're going to talk about this in the second hour a little bit more under another context. But we have this ruling elite which have been empowered and enshrined as a result of a monotheistic religion, be it Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. And they're competing forces, but they seem to be a control mechanism of the same type. And they're just simply warring for which particularly brutal form is going to win. And we have this apocalyptic theater, and this is brilliant. The title of this book grabbed me right away, because for a long time I thought, this feels contrived. It feels artificial. It's alien to the nature of man.
It is.
We were created to love one another. We were created to be part of an entire world that was created for us, and yet we have almost destroyed this planet, and we have destroyed millions, if not billions, of lives over the course of history in the name of these religions. And it's like, my God, when does it stop?
It only stops when people wake up to realize that they have committed a kind of idolatry by enshrining these book gods. All right. My co-author and I took a lot of time, as you know, in that book to show that at least in the case of the modern American pre-tribulational dispensationalist system, that you have a system that was indeed deliberately contrived, number one, and number two, deliberately contrived, in our opinion, to serve the moneyed interests of the elites and the geopolitical imperatives of the British Empire and then later the American Empire. All right. Mm-hmm. The system is, as you know, we spent some time in the book talking about Sir Halford Mackinder, famous British geopolitician.
This is huge. Yes.
Yeah, it's very huge. Famous British geopolitician of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And Mackinder, his system is basically based around a conflict, a clash of civilizations. Well, as we point out in the book, the early backers of the dispensationalist system were bankers like Henry Drummond, mm-hmm. oil barons in charge of, California's Union Oil Company, the Union 76 gas stations. In other words, there were big people promoting this rapture system. The University of Oxford, much to our chagrin,
sure, yeah.
was involved in the publication of Cyrus Schofield's reference Bible. Now, here's a man with no academic standing, with no academic credentials whatsoever, and yet the Anglican-controlled Oxford University Press is going to publish this piece of theological swill. This means, to put it very bluntly, this means that there are major players that want this system out into the world as a major meme. And the purpose of it, Randy, is for the manipulation of a geopolitical agenda in the name of a religion. Not for nothing did these early dispensationalists send delegates to the early Zionist congresses mm-hmm. at the end of the 19th and at the turn of the 20th century. So, yeah, it's a huge, huge story. And, I urge people to look into this, because if they're following this nutty rapture system, they are preparing the ground for their own self-deception, it's vital people wake up and start realizing that a God of love does not require you to go slaughter your neighbor. The bottom line, the question everyone should ask themselves, if they are really biblical literalists, is if God told you to go slaughter your neighbor because he was of Nephilimic blood or some other sort of nonsense, would you do it? And if for a moment it gives you pause, then in that pause you are questioning the entire system. So be honest with yourself and admit it.
I think we're going to break this hour on that note. Again, the book is Yahweh, the Two-Faced God, Theology, Terrorism, and Topology. It has over its title head Apocalypse Theater, and I think that pretty much sums up where this all heads unless we turn the corner on it. And I think you can tell I'm a little emotional about this, and it actually surprised me, but I spent a couple days living with this book. And the closer we got to interview time, it really started to strike me of how critical it is that people study this out and that they get their minds around what's really been invented here and what has been contrived by the elites who rule this world right now. So we'll take a break at this side, and we'll come back on the other side. We're going to talk about, Nazi technology, things that have been hidden from us, the Nazi International, which still survives today. And we'll do all that on the other side of Off Planet Radio. I'm Randy Moggins. We'll be back in about 6 minutes.